They laughed when she moved into an abandoned well. Gunnar Torvik, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried his first wife to the cold, told her plainly, "A girl cannot survive in a hole in the ground. When the real cold comes, they will find your body at the bottom, frozen solid, and no one will even know to look." She had 63 cents, no family within 500 miles, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 9 hours. But 5 months earlier, Ragna Dahl had never spent a single night outdoors in her life. She had spent plenty of nights wishing she were somewhere else. That was different. Wishing cost nothing. Surviving cost everything, and in August of 1887, Ragna Dahl had 63 cents to her name, no family within 500 miles, and nowhere left to go. The Knutson farm sat 3 miles behind her in the darkness. She could still smell the hay from their barn on her stolen blanket. She could still feel Otto Knutson's hand on her arm, his breath on her neck, the way he'd said her name like he owned it. She had driven her knee into his groin and run while he was still doubled over cursing. She had taken the blanket from the porch and the 63 cents she'd earned scrubbing his floors and wringing his wife's laundry and minding his children while Sigrid Knutson recovered from her latest stillbirth. 63 cents. One blanket, the clothes on her back, her mother's shawl wrapped tight against the August night. That was all. Ragna walked until her legs burned, and then she walked further. The prairie stretched flat and featureless under a half moon, the grass silver-tipped and whispering. She had no destination. She had only direction. Away. Away from the Knutsons. Away from Turner County. Away from the territorial orphan system that would send her to an asylum or a poorhouse or another farm where another man would look at her the way Otto had looked. She was 15 years old. Her mother had been dead 4 years. Her father had remarried a woman named Helga Strand, who had 3 children of her own and no room in her house or her heart for a reminder of her husband's first wife. Ragna had been placed out in the spring. Placed out was the polite term. Thrown away was more accurate. By dawn, she had walked 8 miles. Her boots had holes in the soles, and her feet were blistered and bleeding. She found an abandoned homestead at the edge of a dried creek bed, a collapsed sod house, a tumble-down barn missing half its roof, and a stone-lined hole in the ground that had once been a well. The well was dry. The drought that had been emptying Dakota territory of settlers had emptied this one too. The water table had dropped, the family had given up, and now the homestead sat rotting under the endless sky. Ragna looked into the well. It was perhaps 12 feet across and 18 feet deep, lined with hand-fitted stones that showed the labor of men who had expected to stay. Ledges marked where the construction crews had paused to line each section before digging deeper. The bottom was silted with wind-blown dust and a few fallen stones. It was shelter. It was hidden. It was hers. She climbed down using the stone ledges as footholds, scraping her palms and tearing her skirt. At the bottom, the air felt different, cooler than the August heat above, still, somehow, protected. She spread her stolen blanket on the packed earth floor. She wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders. She slept. 3 weeks later, Gunnar Torvik found her. He was a hard man who had been made harder by 11 Dakota winters. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, the smallest and the one beside it, lost to frostbite in the hard winter of 1881 while hauling hay to cattle that died anyway. His first wife, Marta, had frozen to death that same winter, caught between the house and the barn in a blizzard so thick she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. They found her body in the spring, 50 feet from the door she'd been trying to reach. Torvik had remarried. He had rebuilt. He had learned the one lesson Dakota taught everyone who survived: the cold does not forgive. He was checking his cattle range 3 miles from his homestead when he saw smoke rising from near the old Lindgren place. Nobody had lived there in 2 years. Squatters meant trouble. Thieves, maybe, or a family desperate enough to winter in a ruin. Either way, he needed to know. What he found was a girl. She was sitting at the edge of the well, tending a small fire built from scavenged barn wood. Thin, young, Norwegian by the look of her, pale hair, high cheekbones, the stubborn set to her jaw that marked the women who crossed the ocean and didn't die. She watched him approach without running. Torvik dismounted and studied the scene. The collapsed sod house, the ruined barn, the well with a rough platform of boards visible at the bottom, and a rope ladder made of twisted grass hanging down the stone wall. The girl was living in the well. He had seen many things in 11 years on the prairie, sod houses so crude they collapsed in the first rain, dugouts carved into hillsides where families of 8 shared a single room with their chickens, men who ate their horses rather than turn back, women who buried 3 children in one winter and planted crops over the graves. He had never seen anyone try to winter in a well. Torvik said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the Knutsen girl, the one who ran." Ragna's face didn't change. "I'm nobody's girl. Otto Knutsen says you stole money in a blanket, says you're not right in the head. Otto Knutsen is a liar." Torvik looked at her, looked at the well, looked at the pitiful pile of supplies she'd scavenged, some boards, a tin bucket, a handful of dried rose hips. "What do you think you're going to do here?" he asked. "Winter in a hole?" "Yes." "You'll die." "Maybe." Torvik walked to the edge of the well and looked down. 18 feet of stone walls, a platform of salvaged boards at the bottom, a nest of prairie grass that served as a bed. "A girl cannot survive in a hole in the ground," he said. His voice wasn't cruel, it was flat, factual. The voice of a man explaining gravity to someone about to step off a cliff. You have no stove, no fuel, no food, no means to get any of them. When the temperature drops below 0, and it will drop below 0, the earth itself freezes. By February, the frost will reach 6 feet down. You'll be entombed in ice. He paused. I buried my first wife when she froze 50 feet from our door. 50 feet, with a house and a stove waiting for her. When the real cold comes, they will find your body at the bottom, frozen solid, and no one will even know to look. Ragna stood. She was nearly as tall as Torvik, though she weighed perhaps half what he did. "Then no one will miss me," she said. Torvik studied her. Something had happened at the Knutsen farm. He could see it in the way she stood, coiled, ready to run or fight. He had daughters. He knew that look. "Come to Freeman," he said. "The church can arrange placement, a family, a position, something better than this." "No." "The territorial relief officer." "No." He could force her. He could tie her to his horse and drag her to town, but she would run again. Girls like this always ran, and truthfully, the territorial institutions were not places he would send his own daughters. He had heard stories. Everyone had heard stories. "You have maybe 10 weeks until first hard frost," Torvik said finally. 8 cords of wood to survive a winter. That's what a sod house needs, and a sod house has walls and a stove. You can't cut 8 cords. You can't build walls. You can't buy a stove for 63 cents if that's even what you have left. He shook his head. "The arithmetic doesn't work, girl. It doesn't matter how stubborn you are. The cold doesn't care about stubborn. The cold just kills." He mounted his horse. When you change your mind, Freeman's 8 miles east. Follow the creek. Ask for the Lutheran church. Tell them Torvik sent you. He paused. If you don't freeze first. He rode away without looking back. Ragna watched him go. Then she climbed down into her well, sat on her platform of salvaged boards, and began counting the stones in the walls. She counted 2,416 before she lost track. She started over. The first frost came in the 3rd week of September. Ragna woke in the dark at the bottom of the well, wrapped in her single blanket, and realized she wasn't as cold as she should be. Above her, through the open circle of the well mouth, she could see her breath clouding in starlight. The temperature had dropped. 28 degrees, maybe. 30. Cold enough that the grass above was white with ice. But down here, at the bottom of the well, her breath barely clouded at all. She pressed her hand against the stone wall. Cool, not cold, not frozen. The stone felt like it had been sitting in shade on a September afternoon, not exposed to a hard frost. She climbed out at dawn. The world above was transformed. Every blade of grass sheathed in white crystal, the air sharp enough to hurt. She crossed her arms against the wind and shivered. Then she climbed back down. The difference was immediate. 10 feet down, the wind vanished. 15 feet down, the air felt almost warm. At the bottom, she could breathe without her chest aching. Ragna sat on her platform and thought. Her mother had kept a root cellar in Norway. Ragna remembered playing in it as a child, the cool dark in summer, the surprising warmth in winter when the snow piled deep outside, but the potatoes in the cellar never froze. Her mother had explained it once. The earth holds the summer, she'd said. The deeper you go, the more summer it remembers. The earth holds the summer. Ragna looked at the stone walls around her. 18 feet of earth on all sides. If her mother was right, if the earth held warmth the way a stone holds heat from a fire, then maybe the well wasn't a tomb. Maybe it was a cellar 18 feet deep instead of 6. She needed to test it. Over the following weeks, Rosina tracked the temperature as carefully as she could without a thermometer. She had her own body. She knew what shivering felt like. She knew what cold that kills felt like. She'd felt it as a child during one bitter crossing when 3 passengers died and were buried at sea. She knew that when her hands went numb and clumsy, she was in danger. She knew that when her feet stopped hurting, the pain had passed into something worse. She spent nights on the surface and nights in the well. She compared. On the surface, frost nights left her shaking by midnight. Her teeth chattered until her jaw ached. Sleep came in fragments, broken by cold. In the well, frost nights were uncomfortable but survivable. She shivered, but not violently. Her hands stayed flexible. Her feet ached, but didn't go numb. The difference was perhaps 20 degrees, perhaps 25. Enough to mean everything. By early October, Ragna had her answer. The well stayed warmer than the surface by at least 20 degrees, possibly more. Below the frost line, wherever that was, the earth didn't freeze. It held steady, like her mother's root cellar, like a cave, like a promise. If she could seal the opening, trap the warm air, block the wind, she might survive. It was insane. Gunnar Torvik had said so. Any sensible person would say so. A girl alone, in a hole, with no stove, no fuel, no food worth mentioning, trying to outlast a Dakota winter through sheer depth. But the alternative was Freeman. The alternative was the territorial relief officer. The orphan institutions, another placement with another family where she would scrub floors and wring laundry and pray that the husband kept his hands to himself. The alternative was surrender. Ragna began planning. Birgit Haugen found her 2 weeks later. Birgit was 34 years old, a widow with 2 sons, Eric, 12, and Anders, 9. Her husband, Johan, had died 3 years earlier from an infected wound that turned his leg black and killed him in 6 days of screaming. She had kept the farm alone since then, working alongside her boys, trading labor with neighbors when she could, accepting help from no one unless she could call it trade. She was searching for a stray cow when she saw the girl at the old Lindgren well, dragging a board twice her own length across the frozen grass. Birgit watched for a moment. Then she tied her horse and approached. "You're building something," she said. Ragna looked up, a Norwegian woman, worn hands, sun-browned face, the particular exhaustion of someone who worked from dark to dark every day. Not hostile, just curious. "A cover," Ragna said, "for the well." Birgit walked to the well's edge and looked down. She saw the platform, the grass bedding, the rough ladder of twisted rope. "You're the girl Torvik told me about, the one living in the hole." "My name is Ragna. Birgit Haugen." She studied the construction materials scattered around the well mouth, boards salvaged from the collapsed barn, coils of rope, bundles of hay. "You think a cover is going to save you?" "I think it might help." Birgit raised an eyebrow. "Help with what? Keeping out the snow?" "Keeping in the warm." Birgit laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, more surprised. "There's no warm to keep in. It's a hole in the ground." "It's warmer at the bottom than the surface. I've tested it." "In October, maybe. Wait until January. The cold goes deep. By February, the frost reaches 6 feet down. Everyone knows this." 6 feet, Ragna said. "I'm 18 feet down." Birgit paused. She hadn't thought about it that way. Root cellars were dug below frost line, 4 feet, 5 feet, enough to keep vegetables from freezing. She had never considered what happened at 18 feet. "You think the earth stays warm that deep, all winter?" "I think it might. I think it's worth finding out." Birgit looked at the girl, 15, maybe 16, thin as a fence rail, stubborn enough to drag lumber across a frozen field rather than ask for help. "My sod house has 18 inches of earth in the walls," Birgit said. "On a bad night, with the stove going full, it still drops to freezing inside. You think 18 feet of earth is going to do what 18 inches can't?" "18 inches with wind blowing through the cracks," Ragna said. 18 inches with a door that doesn't seal and a window that leaks. Down there, there's no wind, no cracks, just earth." Birgit was quiet for a moment. "You might be right," she said finally. "You might be completely mad. I honestly can't tell." "That makes two of us." Birgit almost smiled. Then her face hardened into something practical. "You're going to freeze to death or you're going to starve. Either way, you'll be dead by spring. I have work that needs doing, and you look like you can work. Come stay with me. Room and board in exchange for labor. It's not charity, it's trade." Ragna shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because if the county relief officer finds me, he'll send me back to the Knutsons, or worse." Birgit's expression flickered. She knew the Knutsons. She knew Otto Knutsen's reputation, not well enough to repeat, but well enough to suspect. A girl who ran from that household in the middle of the night with nothing but a blanket had reasons. "Stay hidden then," Birgit said. "Stay at the farm during the day. Sleep here if you want. But let me help." "Why?" Birgit looked at the well, at the boards, at the girl who was trying to build herself a burrow like a prairie dog, like an animal, like someone with no other choice. "Because I have sons," Birgit said, "and if something happened to me, I'd want someone to help them." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a cloth bundle, 5 pounds of flour, a small slab of salt pork. "Payment in advance," she said, "for helping me find that stray cow. which you're going to help me find right now. Ragna looked at the food. A week's survival, maybe more. She could refuse. Accepting help was dangerous. Help created obligations. Obligations created vulnerability. But hunger was more dangerous than obligation. Which direction did you see her last? Ragna asked. They found the cow in a ravine half a mile east, stuck in mud that had frozen around her legs overnight. It took 2 hours to free her, both of them hauling on ropes while the cow bellowed and kicked, and finally lurched free in an explosion of ice and filth. They walked back together, leading the cow between them. The cover is a good idea, Birgit said, but you're building it wrong. Wrong how? You're trying to seal it flat like a lid. That won't hold snow weight. Build it pitched like a roof. Snow slides off. And leave a gap at the edge, not for wind, for air. You need to breathe down there. Ragna hadn't thought about ventilation. She'd been so focused on keeping heat in that she'd forgotten about keeping herself alive. How do you know about building? She asked. My husband died. I had to learn everything he knew or lose the farm. Birgit's voice was flat. I know about building. They reached the well site. Birgit studied the materials Ragna had gathered. The boards, the rope, the hay. You don't have enough. Not for a pitched cover that'll hold. I know. I'll find more. The old Swanson place is 2 miles north, abandoned last spring. Their barn still has most of its roof. Birgit paused. I'll tell you where it is. That's not help. That's information. She told her. One more thing, Birgit said as she mounted her horse. Torvik thinks you're going to die. Half the county thinks you're going to die. The other half thinks you're touched in the head. Otto Knudsen is telling everyone you're a thief and a runaway. I know. What are you going to do about it? Ragna looked at her well. At the 18 feet of stone and earth that might keep her alive or might become her grave. I'm going to survive, she said, and then none of it will matter. Birgit studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. If anyone can do it, she said, maybe it's someone too stubborn to know it's impossible. She rode away, the rescued cow plodding behind her. Ragna watched her go. Then she picked up the board she'd been dragging and went back to work. Otto Knudsen came 2 weeks later. Ragna was fitting boards across the well opening when she heard hoofbeats. She knew who it was before she looked up. She knew the way he sat a horse. Heavy, entitled, like the horse was just another thing he owned. He reined up 10 feet away and looked at her. Found you, he said. Ragna said nothing. Her hands tightened on the board she was holding. It was 4 feet long and 2 inches thick, heavy enough to hurt if she swung it. Otto dismounted. He was a big man, 41 years old, prosperous by frontier standards. He owned 160 acres, 3 horses, 12 cattle. His wife, Sigrid, had borne him 4 children, 3 of whom had lived. He was a deacon at the Freeman Lutheran Church. He gave money to the Territorial Orphan Fund. He was also, Ragna knew, the kind of man who thought the hired girl came with the farm. Sigrid's been worried about you, Otto said. He was smiling. The smile didn't reach his eyes. We've been looking everywhere. When I heard about the crazy girl living in a well, I had a feeling. I'm not going back. You don't have a choice. You're bound to us until spring. You ran out on your contract. That's theft of services. I could have the county sheriff after you. Try it. I'll tell him why I ran. Otto's smile flickered. You'll tell him what? That you threw yourself at me and I turned you away? That you stole money and a blanket when I rejected you? He shook his head slowly. No one will believe a runaway hired girl over a landowner with 40 head of cattle. You know that. Ragna knew it. That was the worst part. She knew exactly how it would go. Her word against his, a penniless orphan against a church deacon, and everyone would shake their heads and say that girls like her were born liars, born trouble, born to end up exactly where she was. Then I guess we have nothing to talk about, she said. Otto walked closer, close enough that she could smell him, sweat and hoarse and something sour underneath. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to come back with me, quietly. You're going to work out your contract like you agreed. And when anyone asks where you've been, you're going to say you got lost and I found you. Simple. And if I refuse? Then I go to Freeman tomorrow. I tell the county relief officer there's a disturbed girl living in a hole in the ground, a runaway with no family, no means, no prospects. They'll send someone to collect you. They'll put you in an institution. You know what those places are like? You'll wish you'd come back to the farm. Ragna's grip tightened on the board. She could swing it. She could knock him down and run. But run where? There was nowhere left. There had never been anywhere. You think anyone will believe you? Otto said. A crazy girl living in a well? They'll say it proves you're touched. They'll lock you up and throw away the key. Maybe, Ragna said, but I won't be locked up with you. Otto's face hardened. The false friendliness dropped away, replaced by something cold and mean. You think you can survive out here? Winter's coming. You have nothing. No food, no fuel, no shelter that isn't a hole in the dirt. You're going to freeze to death. And when they find your body in the spring, everyone will say it was God's judgment on a thief and a liar. Then I guess I'll be judged, Ragna said, but not by you. For a moment, she thought he would hit her. His fist clenched, his jaw tightened. He took a step forward. She raised the board. Otto stopped. He looked at the board, at the set of her jaw, at the 18-foot drop behind her. If he attacked her, she might fall. If she fell, she might die. And then there would be questions, too many questions. You'll die out here, he said, and no one will mourn. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her one last time. Pray for a mild winter, he said, because nothing else can save you now. He rode away. Ragna stood at the well's edge until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she sat down on the frozen ground and cried, hard, gasping sobs that hurt her chest and made her eyes swell shut. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face, stood up, and went back to work. The cover wasn't going to build itself. November came cold and fast. Ragna worked 16 hours a day. She hauled boards from the Swanson place 2 miles each way, carrying as much as she could manage across the frozen prairie. She gathered hay from a collapsed stack near the abandoned homestead, piling it beside the well for insulation. She twisted grass into rope. She scavenged nails from the barn wreckage, pulling them from rotted wood with her bare fingers until her hands were raw and bleeding. The cover took shape piece by piece. She built the frame first, a pitched structure like Birgit had suggested. Boards angled so snow would slide off rather than accumulate. She left a ventilation gap at the peak, small enough to block most wind but large enough to keep air circulating. She layered hay on top, 6 inches thick, then weighted it with stones so the wind couldn't strip it away. Entry was the hardest problem. She needed to get in and out, which meant the cover couldn't be sealed. She designed a trap door on hinges made of leather straps salvaged from the old barn, with a hay-stuffed lid that could be pulled shut from inside. On November 10th, she finished. She climbed down into the well and pulled the trap door closed above her. The darkness was absolute. The silence was total. For the first time since August, she was completely enclosed, cut off from the wind, the sky, the endless watching prairie. She lay on her hay bed and listened to her own breathing. Slow, steady, alive. The temperature that night dropped to 14 degrees above zero. In the well, Ragna estimated it was 44 degrees, a 30-degree difference. She didn't shiver at all. The test came on November 20th. A hard freeze rolled in from the northwest, temperatures dropping to 8 below zero overnight, wind gusting to 30 miles an hour. The kind of cold that killed livestock caught in the open, the kind of cold that made sod houses groan and crack as the earth in their walls froze solid. Ragna woke in darkness, wrapped in her blanket on her hay bed, and felt the cold pressing in from above. The air in the well was colder than it had been, maybe 38 degrees, maybe 35. Cold enough that she could see her breath in the dim light filtering through the ventilation gap. But she wasn't shivering. Her hands were cold but functional. Her feet ached but didn't burn with the warning pain of frostbite. She climbed to the trap door and cracked it open. The wind hit her like a fist. 8 below, maybe colder. Wind chill probably pushing 30 below. She closed the door and descended. 35 degrees in the well, 30 below at the surface. A 65-degree difference. The theory was holding. The collapse happened 4 days later. Heavy wet snow. 8 inches overnight, dense with moisture, weighing far more than the dry powder that usually fell in Dakota. Ragna woke to a sound like a gunshot, cracking wood. She scrambled up the rope ladder in the dark, feeling her way by touch, and reached the trap door just as a second crack echoed through the well. She shoved upward. The door wouldn't move. Snow had piled on top, sealing it shut. She braced her feet against the stone ledges and pushed with everything she had. The door shifted an inch, 2 inches. She could see dim light through the gap, and the board that was bowing downward, ready to snap. She pushed harder. The door swung open, dumping snow onto her head, and she hauled herself out into a world transformed. The cover's central beam was cracked nearly through. Snow had accumulated in a massive drift on the leeward side, weighing down the structure beyond its design. Another hour and the whole thing would have collapsed into the well. Ragna worked for 3 hours in the freezing dawn, shoveling snow, reinforcing the cracked beam with boards braced against the well's stone rim, redistributing the weight. Her fingers went numb, her face burned. She lost feeling in her feet and kept working anyway. By mid-morning, the cover was stable again, barely. The cracked beam would hold for now, but another heavy snow would finish it. She descended into the well and assessed. The temperature inside had dropped during the crisis, maybe 30 degrees now, cold enough that she shivered even in her blanket. The cover's integrity was compromised. If it failed completely, wind and snow would pour in. The well would become a death trap. She needed to strengthen the cover. She needed more materials. She needed help she couldn't ask for. She wrapped herself in hay and blanket and shivered until noon, when the well's temperature slowly climbed back toward 40. Survival was not guaranteed. It had never been guaranteed. But she was still alive, and every day she stayed alive was a day closer to spring. Birgit came 3 days later with supplies Ragna hadn't asked for. 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt pork, and a second blanket that smelled like mothballs and horses. "Payment for spring labor," Birgit said. 2 weeks' work when the planting comes. Agreed? Ragna nodded. Her pride wanted to refuse. Her stomach overruled it. They sat at the well's edge while Birgit examined the damaged cover. She clucked her tongue at the cracked beam, prodded the hay insulation, tested the trapdoor hinges. "You're lucky it didn't kill you," she said. "I know. You need cross bracing and more pitch on the roof, and a drainage channel so meltwater doesn't pool on the boards." "I know." Birgit looked at her. "Do you know how much wood you'd need to fix it properly? 2 days hauling from the Swanson place, minimum. And you're running out of time. December's here. January's coming. Ragna knew. She knew exactly how precarious her position was. She knew that every day brought her closer to the killing cold of deep winter, the cold that Torvik had warned her about, the cold that froze people in their own homes with fires burning. "I'll make do," she said. Birgit was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Torvik thinks you're going to die. He told me last week, said it's only a matter of time." "Do you think he's right?" Birgit looked at the well, at the cover, at the girl who had built it alone with nothing but salvaged lumber and stubbornness. "I think he might be wrong," she said slowly. "I've never thought about the earth the way you're thinking about it. Deep enough, warm enough, it makes a kind of sense. But I don't know. No one's ever tried what you're trying. Then I guess we'll find out." Birgit stood. She looked northwest toward the horizon where weather came from. "There's something building out there," she said. "I can feel it. My husband used to say he could smell bad weather coming. I never believed him until he was gone." She paused. "January's the killing month in Dakota. The schoolhouse blizzards, the cattle killers, the storms that come out of nowhere and freeze people in their own yards. If a real blizzard hits—" She shook her head. "I don't know if even your well will be enough. Then I'll find out that too." Birgit mounted her horse. She looked down at Ragna with an expression that was equal parts pity and respect. "You might actually make it," she said. "God help you. You might actually survive in that hole." She rode away. Ragna watched her go. Then she took the supplies into the well, stacked them carefully in the storage niche she'd carved into the stone wall, and began calculating. Food for maybe 6 weeks at half rations, 2 blankets, a cover that might hold or might not, a well that had proven itself to 40 below but hadn't faced worse. January was 3 weeks away. The killing month was coming, and Ragna Dahl was still alive. The first week of January brought cold that seemed personal. Temperatures dropped to 30 below on January 3rd, 35 below on the 5th. On January 6th, Ragna woke to air so cold that her breath froze on her blanket before it could rise, leaving a crust of ice crystals on the wool above her face. She didn't climb out that day. The trap door was frozen shut anyway, sealed by ice that had formed overnight in the gap between door and frame. She lay in the darkness of the well and listened to the wind howling above and felt the cold pressing down like a weight. The well held. 40 degrees at the bottom, maybe 38. Cold enough that she shivered constantly, a low-grade tremor that never quite stopped, but not cold enough to kill. Not cold enough to freeze her fingers or blacken her toes. Not cold enough to stop her heart. She burned fuel that day, twisted hay bundles in her tin fire pot, lowered on a rope to add heat to the enclosed space. The fire consumed oxygen, so she could only burn for 15 or 20 minutes at a time before the air grew thick and her head began to swim. But 15 minutes of fire raised the temperature by perhaps 5 degrees, enough to stop the shivering, enough to let her sleep. She rationed the fuel carefully. She had perhaps 40 bundles of twisted hay, plus a small pile of dried buffalo chips and the wood scraps. Enough for maybe 3 weeks of careful burning. After that, the earth's warmth alone would have to sustain her. The thaw came on January 11th. Ragna noticed it first as a sound, dripping water somewhere above. The temperature had risen, not much, but enough. She pushed open the trap door and emerged into a world she barely recognized. The sun was shining. The air felt almost warm. The snow that had piled around the well opening was softening, slumping, turning from white powder to gray slush. Her breath still clouded, but gently. The wind had died to nothing. She stood at the well's edge and let the sun hit her face. It had been weeks since she'd felt direct sunlight, weeks since she'd seen colors other than the brown of earth and the gray of stone. The sky was blue, actual blue, not the white gray of winter overcast. The horizon stretched flat and endless in every direction, the prairie rolling away like a frozen ocean. It felt like spring. Ragna knew it wasn't spring. January thaws happened. She'd heard the old-timers talk about them. A few days of warmth in the middle of winter. Just enough to make people careless. Just enough to make them forget what was coming. But the warmth felt so good that she let herself forget anyway. Just for a day. She checked her snare lines. Empty, as they'd been for weeks. The rabbits had burrowed deep, waiting out the cold in holes of their own. She gathered rose hips from a bush she had missed earlier, frozen solid, but edible, once thawed. She melted snow and drank deeply, the first real water she'd had in days that wasn't mixed with flour paste. By afternoon, the temperature had climbed to the mid-30s. Ragna sat at the well's edge and let the sun warm her, feeling the ice in her bones begin to thaw. She thought about walking to Freeman just to see other people, just to hear other voices. It had been so long since she'd spoken to anyone except Birgit and herself. She decided against it. Otto might see her. The county relief officer might be visiting. Better to stay hidden. Better to stay safe. She descended into the well as the sun began to set. The warmth of the day had raised the well temperature too, nearly 50 degrees at the bottom, warmer than it had been in weeks. She ate a small meal of flour gruel and dried rose hips. She wrapped herself in both blankets. She slept. Above her, the sky began to change. The wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon around 2 in the afternoon on January 12th. Ragna was outside, enjoying what she assumed would be the last warm day for weeks. She saw the cloud first as a darkness, a line of black that seemed to rise from the earth itself, boiling upward like smoke from a fire. It stretched across the entire horizon, from north to southwest, and it was moving, moving fast. She had seen storms before. She had seen blizzards blow in from the northwest, filling the sky with white in a matter of hours. But she had never seen anything move like this. The cloud wall advanced across the prairie like a living thing, swallowing the sun, swallowing the horizon, swallowing everything in its path. She ran for the well. She had perhaps 3 minutes, maybe less. The cloud was moving faster than any horse, faster than any train. She could hear it now, a roar like nothing she'd ever heard, like a waterfall made of wind, like the earth itself screaming. She reached the well and practically fell through the trapdoor, half climbing and half sliding down the rope ladder. She hit the bottom hard, jarring her ankle, and scrambled to pull the trapdoor shut above her. The storm hit before she could close it. Wind slammed into the well opening with a force that ripped the trapdoor from her grip. Snow, not falling but driven horizontally, fine as sand and hard as needles, poured into the well. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it on her skin, the warmth of the day vanishing in seconds, replaced by cold that bit like teeth. She fought the trap door. The wind was stronger. Every time she pushed it up, the gust caught it and tore it open again. Snow accumulated on her shoulders, her head, her face. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. The air was full of ice. She wedged herself against the stone wall and pushed with her legs. The door closed. She held it with her back braced against the ladder, her feet pressed against the wall, her entire body a human lock keeping the storm out. The wind screamed above her. The door shuddered. Snow forced through every gap, sifting down onto her face and neck. She held. The first hour was the worst. The storm raged with a fury that Ragna had never imagined possible. The wind didn't gust, it sustained, a constant howling pressure that seemed to want nothing more than to tear the cover apart and fill the well with killing cold. The temperature dropped like a stone. 30 degrees, 20 degrees, 10. The well, which had held steady at 40 degrees through weeks of bitter cold, began to cool. 35 degrees at the bottom, then 32, then 30. Ragna could see her breath now, thick white clouds in the darkness. She was shivering, not the low-grade tremor of recent weeks, but hard, convulsive shaking that made her teeth chatter and her muscles cramp. The cold was getting in. Despite the cover, despite the depth, the storm was overwhelming the earth's warmth. She climbed down from the trap door. It was frozen in place now, sealed by the ice that had formed in the gaps. The storm couldn't tear it open anymore, but the damage was done. Cold air had flooded the well, displacing the warm, and the temperature was still dropping. 28 degrees, 26. She needed heat. She needed fire. She fumbled in the darkness for her fire pot, for the twisted hay bundle she'd stored in the wall niche. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She dropped the flint twice before she could strike a spark. The hay caught. Flame bloomed in the darkness. The fire helped. A little. The temperature stabilized, but she couldn't burn for long. Already she could feel the air growing thick, the oxygen being consumed. She extinguished the fire and breathed deeply, trying to clear her head. The temperature began dropping again. At some point in the night, Ragna realized she was going to have to choose. She could burn fuel and stay warm, but risk suffocating. Or she could save her oxygen and risk freezing. There was no option that guaranteed survival. There was only calculation. Which risk was greater, which death more likely? She chose cold. She let the fire go out and wrapped herself in everything she had. Both blankets, her mother's shawl, her wool skirt layered over her calico dress. She burrowed into the hay bedding, pulling it up around her like a nest, like a cocoon, like a grave. The temperature at the bottom of the well dropped to perhaps 25 degrees, maybe colder. She couldn't tell anymore. Her body had stopped being a reliable thermometer. All she knew was cold, cold in her bones, cold in her blood, cold pressing against her from every direction. She shivered. The shivering was good. Shivering meant her body was still fighting, still generating heat, still alive. When the shivering stopped, that was when death came. She didn't stop shivering. She lay in the darkness and listened to the storm above. The wind howled. The cover creaked and groaned. Snow sifted through gaps she couldn't see, accumulating somewhere in the well, melting against the warmer stones, refreezing as the temperature dropped. She thought about her mother's hands, rough from work but gentle when they touched Ragnja's face. Her mother's voice, singing Norwegian songs in the darkness of the ship crossing the Atlantic. Her mother's smell, bread and soap, and something sweet that Ragna had never identified. Her mother had died of cholera when Ragna was 11. One day she was there. The next day she was sweating and shaking. 3 days later she was dead, buried in the hard Dakota earth, while Ragna's father stood silent at the graveside, already disappearing into the grief that would eventually drive him into Helga Strand's arms. Ragna had been alone since then, alone in a house with a father who no longer saw her, alone in the Knutsen household where she was labor, not family, alone in this well, 18 feet of earth between her and a storm that was killing people all across Dakota territory. She had been alone so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone. But she was still alive, and as long as she was alive, alone didn't matter. She shivered until dawn. The storm died sometime in the early morning of January 13th. Ragna knew it was over because the howling stopped, not gradually, suddenly. One moment the wind was screaming, and the next moment there was silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that hurt her ears after so many hours of noise. She lay in her hay cocoon and listened. Nothing. No wind, no creaking. Just the sound of her own breathing and the distant drip of melting ice somewhere in the well. She tried to move. Her body resisted. Her muscles had locked up during the night, cramped from hours of shivering, stiff from cold. It took her 5 minutes to unwrap herself from the blankets and hay, and another 5 to stand. The well was cold. Colder than it had ever been. Maybe 22 degrees at the bottom. Maybe less. But she was alive. She climbed toward the trap door. Her fingers could barely grip the ladder. Her feet slipped on the frost-coated rungs. She moved slowly, carefully, knowing that a fall now could kill her as surely as the storm. The trapdoor was frozen solid, sealed shut by ice that had formed during the night, inches thick. She pushed. Nothing. She pushed harder. Nothing. She was trapped. For an hour, Ragna fought the ice. She hammered at the trap door with her fists. She kicked it with her boots. She climbed back down, found the broken knife she used for carving, and climbed back up to chip at the ice around the edges. Her fingers grew numb. Her arms ached. The ice refused to yield. The air in the well was getting stale. Not dangerous yet. The well was large, and there were gaps in the cover that let some air in so, but close. Another day trapped, and she would begin to suffocate. She had survived the storm. She would die of ice. She kept chipping. She kept pushing. She kept fighting. And then she heard voices. The sound came from above, muffled by the frozen cover, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. But voices, human voices, Norwegian words she couldn't quite make out. She screamed. She screamed until her throat was raw, until her voice cracked and broke, until she was making sounds that weren't words anymore, just noise, just desperation, just please, please, please hear me. Scraping sounds above, something heavy being moved. A crack of light appeared at the trapdoor's edge, blinding after so many hours of darkness. The trapdoor lifted. Birgit Haugen's face appeared in the opening, backlit by a sun so bright it hurt to look at. Ragna? Birgit's voice was shaking. Ragna, are you alive? Ragna looked up at her, at the circle of blue sky behind her, at the 2 boys, Eric and Anders, standing at the well's edge with shovels in their hands. I'm alive, she said, and then she began to cry. They pulled her out of the well with ropes because she couldn't climb. Her legs wouldn't hold her. Her hands couldn't grip. She had been in the darkness for nearly 36 hours, and her body had forgotten how to work. Birgit wrapped her in blankets. Eric and Anders fed her hot soup from a jar they'd carried against their bodies to keep warm. She sat in the snow at the well's edge and looked at the world the storm had made. Everything was white. The prairie, the sky, the air itself, white and silent and still. The drifts were 6 feet deep in places, 8 feet in others. The collapsed sod house had vanished entirely, buried beneath a wave of snow. The barn wreckage was just a mound, and everywhere, the silence. How bad? Ragna asked. Birgit's face told her before the words did. Bad, Birgit said. We don't know yet how bad, but bad. They walked back to Birgit's homestead. Ragna supported between Birgit and Eric, her feet dragging in the snow. The sun was painfully bright. The cold was still brutal, maybe 20 below, maybe colder, but without the wind it felt almost warm. Birgit's sod house had survived, barely. The chimney had clogged with ice during the storm, and the stove had nearly failed. The interior temperature had dropped to 12 degrees at the worst point. The boys had frostbitten toes. Birgit's fingers were blistered where she'd burned them trying to clear the chimney. But they were alive. "We thought you were dead," Anders said. He was 9 years old, too young to understand what he was saying. "Mama said the storm would fill the well with snow and you'd be buried." "Anders," Birgit said sharply. "It's all right," Ragna said. "I thought I was dead too." She slept for 18 hours. The news came in over the following days, traveling by word of mouth from homestead to homestead, from town to town. The schoolhouse blizzard. That's what they were calling it, the children's blizzard. Because so many of the dead were children, caught at school when the storm hit, sent home by teachers who didn't understand what was coming, frozen in fields and ditches and snowdrifts within sight of safety. 200 dead, maybe more. The count kept rising as bodies were found. Lois Royce, a teacher in Plainview, Nebraska, had tried to lead 3 students 82 yards to her boarding house. All 3 children froze to death. Royce survived but lost both feet. Etta Shattuck, 19 years old, had found shelter in a haystack. She survived 78 hours before being discovered. She lost both legs and died from the surgery. The Westphalen sisters, Ida, 8, and Matilda, 13, were found frozen in an open field in Dodge County, holding hands. In Turner County, a neighbor of the Knutsons was found frozen against his barn door, dead 10 feet from shelter, people with houses, people with stoves, people with fuel and blankets and families. Dead, and Ragna Dahl, alone in a hole in the ground, had survived. Gunnar Torvik came to Birgit's homestead on the 3rd day after the storm. Ragna was sitting by the stove, still wrapped in blankets, still unable to get warm no matter how close she sat to the fire. The cold had gotten into her bones, and she didn't know if it would ever leave. Torvik stood in the doorway. He looked older than she remembered. Tired. The kind of tired that came from digging neighbors out of snowdrifts, from searching for bodies, from confronting the limits of everything he thought he knew. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "I told you a girl cannot survive in a hole in the ground." Ragna said nothing. She had no strength for words. "I told you the cold goes deep. I told you the earth freezes. I told you they would find your body at the bottom, frozen solid." He paused. "I was wrong." Ragna looked at him. Gunnar Torvik, who had survived 11 Dakota winters. Gunnar Torvik, who had buried a wife to the cold. Gunnar Torvik, who knew more about survival than anyone she had ever met. He had just admitted he was wrong, to a 15-year-old girl. "How warm was it?" he asked. "In the well, during the worst." Ragna thought. 25 degrees, maybe, at the bottom. Cold enough to shiver, not cold enough to freeze. Torvik nodded slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the white wasteland beyond. "My sod house dropped to 9 degrees inside," he said, "with a stove burning all night, with my wife and I feeding it fuel until we ran out of wood and started burning furniture." He shook his head. 9 degrees with fire, 25 degrees without. 18 feet of earth kept you warmer than 18 inches of sod and a cast iron stove. "The earth holds the summer," Ragna said. "My mother told me that." Torvik turned to look at her. "Your mother was a wise woman. She was a farmer's wife who kept a root cellar. Same thing, out here." He crossed to where she sat and stood looking down at her, his missing fingers, his weathered face, his eyes that had seen things she hoped she would never see. "I've survived 11 winters in Dakota," he said. "I thought I understood cold. I thought I understood survival. You survived something I could not have survived, with nothing but a hole and a blanket." He paused. "I underestimated you. I underestimated the earth. I won't make that mistake again." He didn't apologize. Frontiermen didn't apologize. But he acknowledged. And in Dakota, acknowledgement was worth more than words. The spread began slowly. First, it was Birgit, telling her neighbors about the girl who survived the blizzard in a well. Then it was Torvik explaining the principle to anyone who would listen, the frost line, the thermal mass, the way the earth held warmth, the way a stone holds heat from a fire. Within a month, 3 families had begun expanding their root cellars, not to live in, but to survive in, when the stoves failed. Emergency shelters, storm holes, places to hide when the killing cold came. Within 6 months, the design had spread to Turner County, Hutchinson County, and beyond. Dugout shelters, earth-bermed storm cellars, structures that went down instead of up, that used the earth's warmth instead of fighting it. Ragna shared freely. She drew diagrams in the dirt for anyone who asked. She explained the depth, 18 feet minimum. She warned about the cover, about ventilation, about wet clothing. She answered every question with patience she didn't know she had. She never charged for the information. She had stumbled onto physics by accident, she said. It seemed wrong to profit from physics. When people asked how she'd known to dig so deep, she told them about her mother, about the root cellar in Norway, about the summer the earth remembered. Her mother had been right. She had been right about everything. Birgit's expanded cellar was finished by March, 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, with a trap door and ladder and shelves for supplies. Room enough for 3 people to survive a blizzard without fire if they had to. "You taught me something," Birgit told Ragna as they stood at the cellar's edge, looking down into the darkness. "I've been fighting the earth my whole life, fighting the cold, fighting the wind, fighting everything Dakota throws at us. You showed me the earth can be an ally, not an enemy. You just have to go deep enough." Ragna looked at the cellar, at the earth walls, the stone lining, the darkness that had once been her tomb and was now her gift. "I didn't show you anything," she said. "The earth showed me. I just survived long enough to tell someone about it." In the spring of 1888, Ragna turned 16. She stayed with Birgit through the planting season, working the fields alongside Eric and Anders, earning her keep and repaying the debt of flour and blankets and rescue. She grew strong in a way she hadn't been before, not just physically, but in the way she held herself, the way she met people's eyes, the way she spoke. She was no longer the girl who had run from the Knutsons with 63 cents and a stolen blanket. She was the girl who had survived the worst blizzard in Dakota history. The girl who had lived in a hole in the ground and outlasted people with houses and stoves and families. The girl who had proven Gunnar Torvik wrong. Otto Knutson never came looking for her again, whether he was afraid of what she might say or simply unwilling to confront her after what she had survived. She never learned. She saw him once in Freeman, across the street from the general store. Their eyes met. He looked away first. That was enough. In the summer of 1889, a Norwegian farmer named Lars Eriksson rode 40 miles to meet the girl who had survived the blizzard in a well. He was 23 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, with hands that knew work and eyes that knew loss. He had buried his first wife and infant daughter to fever the year before. He had heard Ragna's story from a neighbor who had heard it from Torvik, and he had decided that a woman who could survive what she had survived was a woman worth meeting. They talked for 3 hours on Birgit's porch, about Norway, about Dakota, about wells and storms and the things that didn't kill you. about her mother and his wife and all the people they had loved and lost. He asked her to marry him 2 weeks later. She said yes. They homesteaded east of Freeman, where the James River cut through bottomland and cottonwoods grew thick enough to provide real shade. Lars built a frame house with timber hauled from the river breaks, a house with real glass windows and a proper stove, and walls thick enough to keep out the wind. He also built a root cellar, 18 feet deep, Ragna insisted. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of whom grew up knowing the story of the well. They knew about the blizzard, about the cold, about the grandmother they had never met who had told their mother that the earth holds the summer. They knew that when the storms came, and the storms always came, there was a place beneath the house where the cold couldn't reach them. Ragna Eriksson lived 70 more years in that house. She saw Dakota Territory become North Dakota. She saw sod houses replaced by frame houses replaced by houses with central heating. She saw the prairie tamed, or at least subdued by roads and railroads and electricity. She never forgot what it felt like to be alone in the dark, with the wind howling above and the earth holding her close. She was buried in 1847, at 84 years old, in a Norwegian Lutheran churchyard 3 miles from where her well still stood. Her children stood at the graveside. Her grandchildren stood behind them. The pastor spoke of faith and perseverance and God's mysterious ways. But Ragna would have said it was physics and a mother's wisdom, and the simple fact that if you go deep enough, the earth remembers summer even in the darkest winter. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 9 hours. The wind reached 60 miles per hour. The fine ice crystals in the air could suffocate a horse. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. 235 people died in Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Farmers and ranchers and school children and teachers, frozen in fields and ditches and barns and houses, frozen 10 feet from safety, frozen with their hands reaching for doors they could not find. Gunnar Torvik, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried a wife to the cold, had stood over a 15-year-old girl and told her plainly, "A girl cannot survive in a hole in the ground. When the real cold comes, they will find your body at the bottom, frozen solid, and no one will even know to look." The real cold came. Surface temperature, 40 degrees below zero. Wind chill, 70 below. Cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs and the blood in your veins. At the bottom of an abandoned well, 18 feet below the frozen prairie, the earth held steady at 25 degrees. Ragna Dahl wrapped herself in hay and shivered through the longest night of her life. When the sun finally rose on January 13th, she was still shivering. She never stopped.